check whether that microphone is working. And it's supposed to work. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. All right. Never hurts to check the microphone. That's what I learned at Royal Oak over all these years. Interestingly, I woke today in this church and I realized that our conference's CFO is here. And I'm like, did someone told her that I'm going to speak on stewardship? Anyway, welcome, Chichi. It's lovely to see you today. And everyone else. Today we are talking about something that is not probably that usual as we talk. We mostly talk about certain normal religious norms, some customs, some ideas. Today we're going to talk about the finances. Now, how do finances connect with what we can teach about the Bible, what we can see in the ancient writings? It probably connects to the world that we live in. And this world that we live in, it runs on credit. You could see nations borrow, businesses borrow, households borrow, individuals borrow. And that has become so normal that perhaps none of us really questions that anymore. And yet the Bible presents us quite a different view on wealth and money than we potentially could see today being given to us by various people in the world, mainly probably those bank advisors that you ring and they read all those disclaimers that they are qualified to give the advice, and at least you're doing it when you're restructuring your mortgage. And if you recently went through that, this is a usual 1.5 hour sitting on the phone that you have to go through. And these are the people that are qualified to give you advices. Please use their advice when it comes to money. Don't search for your own wisdom too much. A little bit of wisdom doesn't hurt though. So somehow, with this world that we live in, with the society that we live in, we can see it when we look at the scriptures, we moved from something called a stewardship culture to a debt culture. And today we are going to look at the scriptures and also think about what's the essence of that action, taking on debt or entering these credit relationships with a lender. Now, concerns always come when we start talking about the ongoing or upcoming financial crisis. And that's the source of insecurity for many people. I wouldn't say that I'm not worrying about that. I'm also worrying about that because we all live in this world. And when we hear that another financial crisis is just here and we need to deal with that, well, that brings a little bit of disturbance. So how can Christians, how can we, as the ones that follow Jesus, or at least say that we are following Jesus, stay calm even in the midst of the unfolding financial crisis? In some way, I would argue and let's click to the next slide. Yes. In some way, I would really argue that whatever happened in the world within the last 400 years, we call it the Enlightenment, right? And the technological advance, I would argue that actually it is quite overspoken and overestimated. Though, the technological advancement accelerated. Nowadays you can have a computer just in your pocket. That's called your smartphone. Somehow we ended up in a situation where exercising wisdom is not a common thing in the society anymore. And though we have pretty much everything that we need and we can learn and know everything that we need within the touch of our finger, the wisdom seems to be in a very short supply than ever. It's a paradox. Now, the subject that we are examining today is not new. That's been revealed and developed over probably thousands of years, many centuries ago, timeless principles about wealth and well-being and stewardship were revealed in the ancient writings. To start with, and I'm going to surprise you, we're going to read something that is not given in the Bible. But these writings are dated around 600 years before Christ. Yes, this is Aristotle. And that's something that he's written in one of his books that's called Politics by Aristotle. And that's what he says. The most hated sort of wealth getting, and with the greatest reasons, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. And then we're obviously going to some biblical verses that also speak on this topic. Like, for example, Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to one of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. And then we go to Leviticus chapter 25, 35-37. If one of your brethren becomes poor, take no usury or interest from them, but fear your God. Somehow that process is put against fearing God here. You shall not lend him money, or your money for usury, not lend him your food at a profit. In other word, well, let's basically rephrase it. If you're sitting on those endless wealth and big bank accounts, big numbers, but you see that people next to you are suffering and don't have food to eat, something is going wrong with you. But I'm not going to criticize anyone, okay? Let's again begin with certain disclaimer. So we are not approaching this topic today from a financial or economical point of view, but rather from a philosophical and moral point of view. You know, that philosophical perspective is sometimes very important because that gives us an idea what may actually be hidden behind certain processes that we're not even questioning in our life anymore. And see, taking a loan, if you really think about it, emerges from a very interesting human challenge. Our inability to know the future, right? Do you know the future? Well, we sometimes think that we do, but we don't really know the future, don't we? Well, in that sense, a debt is really a way of managing time, and more specifically, managing the uncertainty that comes with this time. None of us is sure of what's going to happen tomorrow, so we can actually loan some money, get some money. When I take out a loan, it essentially, I'm sort of trying to bring something from the future into the present. I'm using someone else's resources today to obtain something that I might or might not have been able to acquire later. Does that make sense? Well, to put simply, let's say you need a new computer, and you want to get a new computer, right? To save enough money for that computer at a certain rate, you have saving capacity, you have certain salary, you have certain income coming through, and you can save money for a new computer. It might take you probably a year, well, let's theoretically say a year, okay? But over the course of that year, things might happen. There's certain uncertainty there. I don't know, you can get sick. A pipe might burst in your house. Life is full of uncertainties. And any of those potential events, a car crash, right? Something else that might pop in. One of those events potentially can hold you back from saving money for your new computer. So instead of waiting, you enter into the credit relationships, right? You take on debt in order to satisfy the desire that you have in the present, rather than waiting for the future to come forward. And that future may never come, right? We don't know. So at its core, a loan is an attempt to decrease the uncertainty of the future. It allows us to exchange future possibilities for present realities. Does that make sense, kind of? Do you understand what I'm talking about? So, what am I giving in exchange for this service? If you think about it again, in a sense, when I enter credit relationships, I'm selling a portion of my future to someone who has lended me money. Well, that's the essence of the exchange. The lender, whether this is a bank or an individual or any other organization, removes the uncertainty from my present, and I get access to the money now instead of in a year time. And I escape potentially, in my mind, certain circumstances that may prevent me from having this money in a year time. But in return, the lender claims a certain portion of my future, because I'll need to work to repay this money back. Does that make sense? I realize that that's not the usual way that the bankers are talking about taking debt. And we know about the positive debts and things, how beautiful it is actually to get a debt, because this is so cheap now. And that's what we've heard for ages, right? It is so cheap now. There is no justification from holding yourself from getting those things that you can get today instead of waiting for a certain time. And this is where the deeper question needs to be asked, and perhaps a deeper temptation starts, and we could potentially see and trace it down. It begins to emerge because the lender doesn't simply expect to receive the same amount of money back, right? There is a certain premium attached to the money that I borrowed. There is an interest to pay. But that's kind of understandable, because the lender is dealing with certain uncertainty on his side, because how would he know that I am able to repay this loan in the future? So the both parties that are entering these relationships are risking, right? Nothing wrong is with that so far. So the borrower takes on the burden of paying the debt in the future, and the lender takes on the risk that the borrower might not repay the loan. And one party is essentially borrowing time, and another party is charging for the uncertainty that comes with providing with this money. Now, it's interesting that there is a certain very deep philosophical idea injected on that, and also you later would see how it becomes potentially a moral issue from a simple transaction. At its core, a loan is an attempt to reduce uncertainty. It allows us to exchange future possibilities for present realities. But there is one issue there, and that issue is called the speeding up of time. Why would I even consider taking on debt? Well, let's make an easy illustration. Well, imagine I get a wagon load of smelly fertilizer, right? What would that allow me to do with my field if I'm a farmer? I can actually invest into fertilizer, then I can put the fertilizer to work at my property, and I can get a bigger amount of crop. So I'm speeding up the success of what I'm getting out of this field. I expect to get more things in the future if I never had taken that loan. And that's where the great temptation potentially starts emerging. From a philosophical point of view, humanity now struggles with so much speed of life. The speed of life has increased. And it's actually interesting that if you think about it, we probably, when we grow up, before we, let's say, 30 years old, we want to speed up the time. We want to get faster to the point of, okay, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be able to do all those things. That's what we tell ourselves. But then when we pass this 30-year mark, we kind of start feeling that the time runs too quickly. It just flies. It's like water in your hand. You cannot hold it in your hands, and you wish you can stop this running of time. Why? Because we have no time. The problem of human life is we have no time. And the time runs out, and we feel like there is no way to turn that time back. But it's interesting that that loan that I potentially take somehow psychologically transfers me from the time that I'm living in now into the time of the future. And that speeds up. You're looking forward to something. In 30 years, I'm going to pay off my house. It gets you to the point where you start living in a time where you're not yet. But you are mentally already there. I don't know how that works. But all those little causes that when you bring it all together, you end up with the life that speeds up so quickly that you cannot even count the weeks. Like it's just, there was one last Sabbath just a day ago, but now it's the week past. And I'm like, where is this all time going? But our life is overburdened with all those rushing things. And we live like we already there. We stop living the present life. We start spending as we already have this money. That's another very important moment that brings me to, because if I have money to spend today, I already psychologically start living in the moment where I earn that. I already transfer myself to the future. And I'm skipping on the life essentially today. It's interesting that the progress, or how we would see that enlightenment that came, put us in a situation where we believe that every single day is going to be better than the previous one. And the future is going to be bright. And we're looking for the future because whatever is happening in 100 years should be better than it's happening now. And we can see the traces of it in the world. Yes, surely with the technological advancement, it actually becomes something that clearly we can see. But again, at the same time, for some reason we think that getting there quickly is so vital that we forget that we have life now. And then later on we realize that this life is gone. But I was looking for the future. I was looking for that event next year. I was looking for my time, when I am free out of my debts, when I am free out of my obligations, because debts put you under obligations. But then when we get there, finally we realize that the time is gone. That's the greatest problem of this debt culture. It doesn't seem necessarily wrong at this stage. We use something that are available, the tools, financial tools that are available for us today to speed up, to accelerate our success. But the time is running even quicker than it was running before. Now, we find ourselves in that moment where we think of the future, it's going to be better. But how do we know that the future is going to be better? How do we know that the success is sure? Well, for some reason, we are the followers of Jesus. We're looking for the second coming because we believe that that time is going to be better, right? So we need to speed up the coming of Jesus. We need to do some certain extra things. Why? Because that time is going to be better. Oh, for sure, we believe that the kingdom of God is going to be better. But that adds on to that speeding up of our life where we understand and realize that we're not living today. We're looking for the things that are yet to come tomorrow. And as a result, we're missing of whatever's happening here and now. Now, we live in this world where the entire system is built on the belief that the future can be controlled. Right? That's what the government tells us. The future is going to be so bright, we're just entering these good times, and these promises. Someone said, I know who that was. There was one of the German chancellors. He said that people don't lie more than actually before election, after the hunt, and at some certain circumstances. We are being promised the great future. But how do we know? How do we human know that the future is actually going to be successful? Of course, we have certain nets in place. All of us, we have insurance. Insurance helps us to deal with this anxiety of what happens if certain circumstances come and arise and I have to deal with it. Insurance helps us, yes. But when we all participate in this credit-based system, we are assuming that everything's going to go according to the plan. I'm taking mortgage for 30 years because I anticipate that I will be able to pay it off. I think that my life is going to be successful. I'm not going to lose my job in the midst of it. I'm going to be able to actually fulfill those obligations. That somehow psychologically puts us under that surety that in the future there's going to be success. But what could be the problem here? The problem is that the knowledge of our future is very limited. Imagine you borrow a large sum of money today based on the assumption of the future success. You assume that the success will come, and on the basis of this future success, I'm taking money now. What if success never comes? And even if it does arrive, it requires me, as an individual that now has obligations, be exceptionally disciplined and capable person, right? Because it requires me to act certain way that I can accumulate this lump of money and pay it back. Are we these people? Imagine a very competent person that comes to you. Some of you are business owners. You have to deal with finances. You have to deal with your even personal finances. Nowadays, it's not an easy thing. You got to keep all things in mind that are happening in your life and have provision for them. Imagine a person comes to you with a very impressive Excel spreadsheet, and everything is just laid out, pretty well. The project looks amazing, solid. The numbers make sense. And the conclusion is simple. If we follow this plan, then in 2 years we will achieve remarkable success because all indicators point us into this direction. That's how, if you think about it, the government functions, the society functions. We assume that nothing will hurt our plans, that we will be successful in anything that we do. Let's look at this borrower. It almost inevitably, that within the person's head, they gradually start living in the future rather than in the present. Because if I'm going there and it's going to be success, and I start already imagining myself being a successful person, owning things which in reality are not mine. Because if you think about the things that we own, it's someone owns it who actually gave us money for that. But we take it as our own. Another thing. See, and there's another temptation there as well. This is now for those who are on the other side of these relationships, who actually are able to give money to the borrowers. If we have that ability to speed up the success or process or the way that we live through this constant lending of money, it makes those who are in charge of the money lending institutions and who actually have these tools at their disposal to print more money, to increase the lending, to give it to everyone. In theory, people, and that's how it was in the past, right? People were very concerned of who actually can borrow money. But nowadays, you can see that we live in that culture where anyone can get any kind of loan, and probably no one really cares about that. If credit is no longer the exception that becomes the norm, then my interest as a lender begin to shift into the opposite direction. I'm just talking about psychology here, because that's what we essentially can see in the society. I want to lend as much money as possible, because in some sense, with this giving money away, I'm buying those people's future. I begin owning those people's future. Whose future is, is your future owned by someone? Think about your obligations. Who owns your future? Do you own your future? Who is owning your future? And now it's interesting that we end up in this is so common now, we don't even think about it. We end up in this situation where countries own trillions of dollars. It's a debt upon debt upon debt upon debt. Where does it lead us? Yeah, think about the election that's going to happen this year. The people that want to get in charge, they will promise all the good things. Do they have money for fulfilling those things? No, because they essentially need to borrow. For all those projects that are happening around, all infrastructure, and again, I'm oversimplifying, right? We can get into the argument of how that actually works, but we all know that the overall debt for the governments in the world is just tremendous. What are we going to do with it as a society? You know, when it all started, and those of you who probably remember those old good days, people were disciplined. You take a loan and you try to repay it as quickly as you can. You try to be responsible. You try to actually exercise wisdom in how you're handling money. Further it goes, less adequate people become. Because nowadays, I can clearly see that people don't really think about that. We just swipe the credit card. Why? Because it's so convenient, it's so easy. We live in this complete debt culture that became part of us. And we become spenders in the present as if we would have the most optimistic scenario of the future coming. But we don't actually know what's going to come. Now, how does this whole thing affect the society that we live from a political perspective? You know, politicians potentially, I'm not trying to label everyone, but you can see the overall tendency there, not necessarily experience the same sense of responsibility over the country as it used to be. Why? Because they are not ultimately those who are going to repay those debts. You know, a good politician gets there for probably 8 years, but think about other organizations as well. People that are executive directors in their companies. I mean, you don't need to deal with the things immediately. You just need to get through a period. You just need to get reelected. And that's that culture that we live in. We just need to get there. The rest, we're going to deal with this later. And then this whole thing leads us to this debts accumulating over generations and generations and generations. And now you have young people coming and saying, who's going to actually pay it off? How on earth are you expecting us to deal with all those difficulties that the society now puts us under? Because essentially we need somehow to pay these debts off. Debts of the country, debts of the households, debts of other institutions that we are part of. And as a result, we have a generation of politicians that are no longer even think that they need to be held accountable for the decisions that they make now. And they keep promising, and they keep promising, and they keep promising. And what even actually happens worse, and you can see it happening in the political world, the things that they get concerned with is actually how during my election time I can earn more money and increase my own wealth. And then the whole different awesome schemes and things are coming out of it. Just open the internet and read. It's interesting that we're now coming to the central question. how we ended up, what actually happens when that culture of stewardship is replaced with this culture of debt. What is the idea of stewardship? How do we explain what this stewardship is? It's a nice, cool word, but what does that mean? The easiest way to illustrate stewardship is probably reading a parable of talents. And the parable of talents, as you would see, is written in Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. You all know this parable. It's that easy. A master prepares to leave on a journey and entrusts his servants with different amounts of money according to their abilities. One servant receives 5 talents, another 2, another 1, and then the master departs. And the first 2 servants put the resources into work. I'm just making a summary for those who forgot about the parable of talents. They invested, multiplied, and produced a return for their master. The third servant, because he fears the circumstances, he fears about the future, he fears that there might be loss, he actually hides the money and doesn't put it anywhere. He doesn't do anything with this money that were invested to him. So when the master returns, he praises the first 2 servants, and because they were faithful with what that had been entrusted to them. And as a result, they are given the greater responsibilities. So the third servant is rebuked, simply because he failed to use what had been entrusted to him. And the central lesson here is very simple. Stewardship is not ownership. Everything belongs to the master. The servants are judged not by how much they were given, but how faithfully they managed what was placed in their care. An important aspect of this parable is that we need to trust the wisdom of the master because he gives to everyone according to his understanding. But the problem is when we disagree with the master and we say, oh, I should have received more than that. I am more capable. That brings us to the point of distrusting the judgment of the master. In that sense, the debt culture can be seen as a form of the disobedience to the master's wise judgment. It is an attempt to take hold of resources that have yet not been entrusted to us. So the logic of this prudence and stewardship works like this. We sacrifice part of the present for the sake of the future. The debt culture works the other way around. We sacrifice part of the future for the sake of the present, hoping that in the future, eventually, we will receive a greater return. You probably would have heard by now about these big predictions that are spoken in the media about the upcoming economical crisis. Anyone heard about that? There's a lot of things going on. There's a certain hysteria around economical crisis. And I would say that, look, this is real, potentially. Why? Simply because we don't know the future, but also so much noise about that it must have some ground there. And we see that the future generations probably would have start paying eventually for that success that the Western world has been handling within the last 30, 40, 50 years. We all heard about the American dream concept, right? You can see that the certain processes are starting working in the world, and the economists say we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to give you surety of the future because whatever worked in the past doesn't work anymore. So under normal circumstances, everything moves in cycles, and that's how you can see the life works. Always it goes up, you have a high, and it drops down. Life is not a constant line that going up and up and up and up. It all goes in cycles, exactly as Ecclesiastes 3:1 says. There is a time for everything. There is time for growth. There is time for recession. There is time for every single activity on earth. There is time for spending money. There is time for, saving money. There is time for being prudent. There is time for being generous. But we behave in a certain contemporary mindset that the time of spending, that time of success, that time of well-being never gonna end, and it every single year gonna be better, 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 better. Life doesn't work like that. See, over certain decades, and I'm not trying to give an analytical explanation on the current economic situation, but even simply applying this logic, after a certain uprising in the growth, there must be recession. And it's interesting that those cycles, as you can see working in history, even with economics as well, are supposed to take the pressure off certain points. Like recession, for example, would stabilize the situation. It would deal with certain over-increase of borrowed money. Yes, someone will go broke, that's right. But those processes are naturally put into the scheme of life to self-regulate, and you would see how it works. Somehow the Jewish people think that, you will exactly receive as much as you need, and if you somewhere received more than you should have, you're probably gonna lose your tooth and spend a few $100,000 on certain other repairs. Obviously trying to pull your leg on that. But that's exactly, you cannot increase the limit. This is a very Jewish concept of what has been entrusted to you. And if for some reason you're gonna draw from somewhere else, you're gonna lose that. It's an interesting concept if you would like to explore it more. They believe that during Hanukkah, at the beginning of the year, you can ask for how much you're gonna get distributed to you. Again, that's their belief. And then you cannot increase that limit up until the next year when you can ask for more. Maybe that's something to do with prayer. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Jewish wisdom. The problem is that the debt grows, and instead of somehow regulating the economy, we're getting more and more and more money and cash pumped at individuals. We are encouraged to spend more. We are encouraged to loan more. We are encouraged to take more. My question is, when is it going to end? It's interesting that there are solutions for this ongoing debt culture that are there, and these are historical occurrences where things were dealt with. Like, for example, in Athens, around 600 BC, there was a person, that happened around 2,600 years ago. Many Athenians were actually having bad debts. It's proven. It's a historical account. There was a guy called Solon. He was a governor. He stepped into that burdened capital of Greece. And what he did, he started something which was actually called shaking off of burdens. Well, what he did, he forgave all debts. He nullified all debts. Well, that sounds good for common people, right? But what about those who actually gave those money to these people? That sounds, again, if you go with the worst case scenario, it sounds like a revolution and very bloody time. And that's why often wars are being used to nullify debts. And every single time the world comes to the point where we cannot handle it anymore, there is a war that's going on and wipes half of the population from the earth. Hopefully we can avoid this situation. I'm not sure whether we can, though. It's interesting that this concept of shaking off the debts is found in the Bible. The Bible's actually the wise stewardship of God. When he spoke certain principles to the people of Israel, he included that, and he said, you should take this principle and govern according to that principle, because he knew that the society is going to go in certain cycles, up and down. He said, look, there is something that I'm giving to you as a concept. Use it and make it actually a policy. And it's interesting because the idea of this concept is revolutionary. That concept is in Leviticus 25, and you must have heard about it. It's called the Sabbath year, or the year of Great Jubilee. Let's quickly skim through. I'm not going to read all the verses there. I'll just read it for you. But you would see the scale of dealing with this overall culture where you cannot go any further. You are stuck. When you are stuck, you need the Sabbath year, or you need the Sabbath Great Jubilee. Count of 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7th Sabbath year amount to a period of 49 years. Then have a trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. For it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. So he says that if you are going to follow these principles that I'm giving to you, you will live in safety. You will prosper. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food for a profit. They are to be treated, I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Sometimes reading from the screen is actually easier than reading from a script. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not take them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work with you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And if you are to take one verse from today, this is that one. Look at it carefully. And it speaks of the land, but you easily can put under that land whatever you own. And that becomes a timeless principle. He says the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners, as strangers. You know, the year of Jubilee is about restoring the freedom. It's about nullifying debt. if it's releasing people back into freedom, taking the burdens out of them. People who had lost everything were given a fresh start at the year of Jubilee. Those trapped by death regained their liberty. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. The world, God says, is mine. It's not yours. What you have is not yours. It's mine. You were entrusted with that by me. But this is mine. You were given something to handle, but this is mine. Everything we have, our money, our homes, our businesses, our talents, even our time, it's all been entrusted to us by God. And this is exactly the lesson that Jesus was teaching in the parable of talents. The servant did not own the master's resources. They were entrusted with them. Proverbs 22:7 speaks very much wisdom that we miss in the contemporary society. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. When we take someone else's money, we enslave ourselves. That's what the Bible says. You want to be free or less enslaved. For some reason, we somehow cannot live here without using these financial tools that are available to us. As we say, the world grows in that debt culture. But can we somehow find the way to be free in this world? Then it comes back to Ecclesiastes. There is time for everything and a season for every activity under heavens. There is time to plant and there is time to harvest. Time to save and time to spend. Time to build and time to release. Time to grow and a time to reset. And the biblical vision assumes that healthy societies, they live within these rhythms. Nothing can go up all the time. It must go down before it goes up. It must be crisis before it becomes good. That's how somehow this world works. The hidden rhythms of world. Stewardship, when we talk about it, is willing to wait. Stewardship accepts limits. The world tells you that you are limitless. No, we are. We have limits. Stewardship understands seasons. Good seasons to spend, good seasons to grow, and not good seasons to spend, and not good seasons to grow. The debt culture is tempted to collapse one season all the seasons into one season. It seeks tomorrow's harvest today, but that doesn't work like that. It spends future resources in the present and assumes that the future growth will solve today's problem. But what if the future is not certain? Yet Jesus himself have warned us, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Or in another place he says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Look, it doesn't mean that we should stop planning. It doesn't mean that we should not dream. It doesn't mean that we should not take risk. Some of us would find their life actually depending on those. The life gets flavor when you take on risk. But we must realize that we are not the owners. We are just the stewards. And perhaps this deepest lesson in this Sabbath year, the year of Jubilee, and biblical stewardship itself, the future belongs to God, not to me. And my task is just to manage faithfully what He had placed in my hands today. Amen.
And start living a life of stewardship. Please stand with us as we sing our last song and our closing song for today, Potter's Hands. I'm captured by your holy calling. Set me apart. I know you're drawing me to yourself. Lead me, Lord, I pray. Take me, mold me, fill me, fill me. I give my life to the potter's hands.
There's time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. What go workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in human's heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to go good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so people will fear him. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for placing some certain mechanisms in our life, in our society, even in our economy, even in the way that people live. We know that the culture that we as humans tend to produce somehow always undermines your authority, somehow always states that we can do better without you. We can achieve more things. We can break our limits. But over time it's proven that we actually cannot. And every single time we try to break these limits, we try to go off your given rules and principles, we end up in a big tragedy as society, as family, as universe. Lord, I pray that you give us humbleness to accept that what we have is not ours. We are not owners. We are just stewards. And let us, Lord, be wise about what has been entrusted into our hands so we can be responsible stewards. And we can, with the time, receive even more, because you would say to us, you are good and faithful servant. You were faithful in small things, and then I will give you more things to handle. And I'm praying that this becomes a guiding principle for all of us in our lives, and that's something that we can share with other people that are living next to us, so they can praise you and fear you, because you are God of wisdom. And let your name be glorified through our life and through how we handle different matters of life. Amen.